I was standing near the church garden, my heels sinking into the soft earth as I watched Eric walk toward the back of Grace Chapel, with that same smug, unaffected expression he wore at the funeral, like none of this mattered to him. I had followed him from the florist, where something chilling had just happened. I had only asked him to buy flowers, simple lilies for Uncle Lawrence's casket, but when I arrived at Marlene Pitt's flower shop, she refused to sell me anything. Instead, she gripped my wrist with surprising strength for an elderly woman, leaned in and whispered, "You need to know the truth before you lay flowers on that grave. Your brother lied to you. Lawrence tried to reach you before he died. Ask him what he burned behind the church last night." My blood turned to ice. So I waited. I followed Eric behind the church, keeping low behind the hedge near the maintenance shed. And when I saw what he pulled out of the trash bin, half-burned letters in Uncle Lawrence's handwriting, still warm from last night's fire, I knew. This wasn't just a funeral. This was a cover-up, and my brother was at the center of it. My name is Sandra Malone, and I never thought saying goodbye to my uncle would become the moment I discovered who my family really was. The morning had started quietly enough. I'd driven from Raleigh to Asheville the previous night, checking into a modest inn rather than staying with Eric. Something about his voice on the phone when he'd called to tell me about Uncle Lawrence's passing had felt off, distant, almost rehearsed. He went peacefully, Eric had said, his voice flat. No need for anything elaborate, just a simple service at Grace Chapel. I'll handle everything. Uncle Lawrence had been the quiet pillar of our family, Dad's older brother, a Vietnam vet who never married or had children. While he wasn't one for grand gestures or emotional declarations, he'd been there for me in ways my own father never was. When I graduated college, when my first serious relationship ended, when Dad died, Lawrence had shown up, usually with little more than a nod, a firm hand on my shoulder, and those gentle eyes that seemed to understand everything without needing words. The morning of the funeral dawned with a misty rain, the kind that seems to hang in the air rather than fall. I dressed in a simple black dress, nothing fancy. Uncle Lawrence wouldn't have wanted fancy. He used to say that peace is the loudest silence a man can hope for. I wanted to honor that silence with dignity. I decided to bring flowers, white lilies, his favorite. Eric had mentioned he'd take care of the arrangements, but something tugged at me to contribute this one small gesture myself. That's when I remembered the little flower shop next to Grace Chapel, Marlene's. Flowers. Lawrence used to mention Marlene sometimes. An old friend, he'd said. When I pulled up to the chapel, the parking lot was nearly empty. Just 3 cars, Eric's sleek black BMW, Pastor Wilson's old station wagon, and a faded blue pickup I didn't recognize. The funeral wasn't for another hour. I had time. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered Marlene's shop. The air inside was humid and sweet, alive with the scent of fresh blooms. An elderly woman with silver hair pinned in a neat bun looked up from behind the counter, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "Good morning," she said warmly. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like some white lilies, please," I replied. "They're for a funeral." Her smile remained, but something flickered in her eyes. "Of course. Who are they for, if you don't mind my asking?" "My uncle, Lawrence Malone." The change was immediate and dramatic. Her smile vanished, and her hand, which had been reaching for a notepad, froze in midair. She stared at me with an intensity that made me step back. "You're Sandra, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, stunned that she knew me. She came around the counter. Then, moving with surprising quickness for a woman her age. Before I could react, she had taken my wrist in her hand, her grip unexpectedly strong. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Your uncle tried to reach you before he died. He left things for you. Things Eric doesn't want you to see." My heart began to pound against my ribs. "What things? What are you talking about?" "Letters," she replied, "and documents. About property. He wanted you to have something, and he was worried. Said Eric was pressuring him, trying to make him sign papers." She glanced nervously at the window, then back at me. "I saw your brother behind the church last night. He was burning something, papers." I felt cold suddenly, despite the warmth of the shop. "How do you know all this?" "Lawrence was my friend for 40 years, she said simply. "He trusted me, and he loved you." She released my wrist and hurried back behind the counter, rummaging beneath it for something. "I don't have the originals, but I have this." She pulled out a small brown envelope. "He gave me copies just in case." said he had a bad feeling. I took the envelope with trembling hands. I don't understand. You will, she said, glancing again at the window. But not here. It's not safe. Your brother comes in sometimes, takes pictures of my shop, says he's interested in buying the building. The bell above the door jingled, and we both jumped. But it was just a delivery man with fresh flowers. Marlene leaned close one last time. Ask your brother what he burned behind the church last night. Watch his face when you do. I left without the lilies, the small brown envelope burning a hole in my purse. Outside, the mist had thickened into a light rain. I sat in my car, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The envelope felt heavy in my hands. I should open it, see what was inside. But something stopped me. A feeling that once I did, nothing would ever be the same again. I glanced at my watch. 45 minutes until the funeral. I started my car and pulled around to the back of the church, parking where I couldn't be seen from the main lot. I needed to clear my head, to think. That's when I saw him, Eric, walking quickly from the chapel toward the old maintenance shed at the edge of the property. His shoulders were hunched against the rain, but his stride was purposeful. Without thinking, I got out of my car, staying low behind the hedgerow that lined the property. The soft earth gave beneath my heels as I followed at a distance. Eric stopped at a large metal trash bin behind the shed. He glanced around. I ducked lower behind the hedge, then lifted the lid and reached inside, pulling out what looked like charred paper fragments. He examined them closely, as if making sure they were sufficiently destroyed. Then, seemingly satisfied, he dropped them back in and closed the lid. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. He bent down and picked up a piece of paper that had fallen to the ground, a fragment that had escaped the flames. Even from my hiding place, I could see his expression darken as he read whatever remained on it. He crumpled it in his fist and shoved it into his pocket, then strode quickly back toward the chapel. I waited until he was gone, then approached the trash bin, my heart hammering in my chest. It smelled of smoke and wet ash. Steeling myself, I lifted the lid and looked inside. Charred paper fragments filled the bottom, some still warm to the touch. I carefully lifted out a few larger pieces, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Most were burned beyond recognition, but on one fragment I could clearly make out Uncle Lawrence's distinctive handwriting, and 3 words that made my blood run cold. Sandra, land, and not Eric. I stood there in the rain, pieces of burned paper in my hands, trying to comprehend what I was holding. These weren't just random documents. They were fragments of my uncle's final wishes, deliberately destroyed by my own brother. The sound of car doors slamming in the main parking lot jolted me back to reality. The first mourners were arriving. I quickly took photos of the most legible fragments with my phone, then placed everything back in the trash bin exactly as I had found it, save for one small piece, the one with my name on it, which I slipped into my purse alongside Marlene's envelope. I made my way around to the front of the chapel, smoothing my hair and wiping raindrops from my face. I needed to appear normal, composed. The gravity of what I'd just discovered weighed on me like a stone, but this was neither the time nor the place to confront Eric. Not yet. Inside, the chapel was sparsely populated. Uncle Lawrence hadn't been a social man, and most of his contemporaries had already passed. A few elderly veterans sat together in one pew, their weathered faces solemn beneath silver hair. Pastor Wilson stood at the pulpit, arranging his notes. And there was Eric, standing near the simple wooden casket, greeting the few attendees with practiced solemnity. When he saw me, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle tensing of his jaw. Then the mask of grief slipped back into place, and he moved toward me, arms outstretched. Sandra, he said, embracing me briefly. I'm glad you made it. I hugged him back, fighting the urge to recoil. Of course I came, I replied. He was important to me. Eric nodded, his eyes never quite meeting mine. It's what Lawrence would have wanted. Simple, dignified. He gestured toward the casket, which was adorned with a single spray of white lilies. I got his favorite flowers. My stomach clenched. Yes, I was going to get some too. I stopped by Marlene's shop earlier. His reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight widening of the eyes, a moment's stillness. Marlene Pitts? You spoke with her? Briefly, I said, watching him carefully. She seemed upset about Uncle Lawrence's passing. They were old friends, I believe, Eric said dismissively, though I'm not sure how close they really were. Lawrence was a private man. Yes, he was, I agreed, then added almost casually, "What were you doing behind the church last night, Eric?" His face went perfectly still, like water freezing instantly. "What?" "Behind the church," I repeated. "Someone mentioned seeing you there." His recovery was quick but not perfect. A forced chuckle, a too casual shrug. "I came by to check on the arrangements, walked the grounds, wanted everything to be right for today." "In the rain? At night?" His eyes hardened. "What exactly are you implying, Sandra?" Before I could respond, Pastor Wilson called for everyone to take their seats. The service was beginning. I sat in the front row, Eric beside me, acutely aware of the tension radiating from him. The service passed in a blur. Hymns I didn't sing, prayers I couldn't focus on, eulogy words that failed to capture the man I knew. All I could think about was the envelope in my purse and the burned fragments in the trash bin. After the final prayer, as people began to disperse, Eric leaned close to me. "There's a small reception at my house," he said. "Just a few people. You'll come, of course." It wasn't a question. "Actually," I said, "I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. I think I need some time alone to process." Disappointment flickered across his face, quickly replaced by understanding. "Of course. Grief affects us all differently. Why don't you come by tomorrow morning instead? We can have breakfast, talk about Lawrence's affairs. There's not much to settle, but there are a few matters we should discuss." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As we walked out of the chapel, I noticed Marlene standing at the back, partially hidden behind a column. Our eyes met briefly, and she gave an almost imperceptible nod. Eric didn't see her. He was too busy shaking hands with Pastor Wilson, playing the role of the grieving nephew with practiced precision. "I'll see you tomorrow, then," I said, already backing toward my car. "Around 9? "Perfect," Eric replied. "And Sandra? I'm glad we're handling this together. Family is all we have in the end." The irony of his words was not lost on me. Back at my inn, I locked the door, drew the curtains, and finally opened Marlene's envelope with trembling hands. Inside were several photocopied documents, letters from Uncle Lawrence to me that I had never received, and most significantly, a notarized will dated just 3 months before his death. The letters were heartbreaking in their simplicity. Lawrence explaining that he'd been trying to reach me, that Eric had been pressuring him to sell his mountain property to developers, that he wanted me to have the land because you're the only one who loves it for what it is, not what it could be worth. And the will, legally executed and witnessed, left the 15 acres of pristine mountain land overlooking the valley, not to Eric, but to me. My phone rang, startling me. Eric's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. A text, followed moments later. "Hope you're feeling better. Looking forward to breakfast tomorrow. So much to discuss about Lawrence's wishes." I stared at the message, then at the will in my hands. According to this document, Lawrence's wishes were clear, and they were nothing like what Eric had implied. I needed help, legal help, and I needed it before I sat down with my brother tomorrow. I searched online for attorneys in Asheville and found one who offered emergency consultations. Caroline Desmond, estate law specialist. Her website promised discretion and expertise. I called the after-hours number and was surprised when she answered herself. "This sounds urgent," she said after I explained the situation, "and potentially serious. Destruction of estate documents is a criminal offense. Can you come to my office now?" An hour later, I sat across from Caroline in her downtown office, the photocopied will and letters spread out between us. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "These copies would constitute evidence," she said, "but they're not the originals. We'd need to establish that the originals existed and were destroyed. Do you have any other evidence?" I showed her the photos I'd taken of the burned fragments and the one piece I'd kept. Her eyebrows rose. "This is compelling," she said, "but still circumstantial. We'd need testimony from Marlene Pitts about what she witnessed and why your uncle gave her these copies." "Will that be enough?" I asked. Caroline leaned back in her chair, considering. "Possibly. It depends on what your brother has already filed with the probate court. If he's submitted a different will, an earlier one perhaps, and if he's already initiated proceedings." She trailed off, then fixed me with a direct gaze. "Ms. Malone, are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this? Family estate disputes can become ugly, expensive, and emotionally devastating." I thought about Eric's face. As he burned those letters, about Uncle Lawrence trying to reach me in his final days, about the land that meant so much to both of us. I'm certain, I said. It's not about the property or its value. It's about honoring what my uncle wanted, and about the truth. Caroline nodded, satisfied. Then here's what we need to do. As I drove back to the inn, a plan taking shape, my phone rang again. Eric. Again, I let it go to voicemail. His message was brief but telling. Sandra, I hope you're not listening to gossip from people who barely knew Lawrence. Some people have strange agendas. I have his will here, the real one, and I think you'll find everything is in order. See you tomorrow. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, a cold determination settling over me. Tomorrow wouldn't go as Eric planned. Tomorrow, the ashes of truth would rise, phoenix-like, to reveal what my brother had tried to burn away. And I would be ready. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Uncle Lawrence's face, not as he'd appeared in the casket, waxy and unfamiliar, but as he'd been in life, weathered, gentle, with eyes that spoke volumes his mouth never did. I imagined him trying to reach me, being intercepted by Eric, growing increasingly desperate as his health failed. By morning, exhaustion had hardened into resolve. I dressed carefully in a navy pantsuit, professional, serious, and drove to Caroline Desmond's office to pick up the documents she'd prepared overnight. She handed me a thick manila folder. Remember what we discussed, she said. Don't accuse directly. Ask questions. Record everything if you can. We need evidence of his knowledge and intent. I nodded, my throat tight. And you've filed the temporary injunction? First thing this morning, she confirmed. If he's already submitted the false will to probate, any transactions he attempts regarding the property will be frozen pending investigation. But he doesn't know that yet. The drive to Eric's house took 20 minutes, winding through Asheville's historic district, before climbing into the affluent neighborhoods nestled in the foothills. His home was exactly what you'd expect. A sprawling modern structure of glass and stone perched on a ridge, showcasing panoramic mountain views through floor-to-ceiling windows. Ostentatious. Nothing like the modest cabin Uncle Lawrence had loved. Eric answered the door himself, dressed in casual designer clothes, a practiced smile on his face. Sandra, right on time. Come in. Coffee's ready. I followed him through the minimalist great room to the kitchen, where he'd set out an impressive breakfast spread, fresh pastries, fruit, imported cheeses, as if food could soften what was coming. You've gone to a lot of trouble, I said, accepting the coffee he offered. Not at all. It's the least I could do. He gestured toward the dining table. Shall we? We sat across from each other, the massive windows framing the Blue Ridge Mountains behind him. I wondered if he'd chosen this seat deliberately, positioning himself against that majestic backdrop like some feudal lord surveying his domain. Beautiful view, I commented, buying time as I surreptitiously started the voice recording app on my phone. It is, he agreed, though nothing compared to Lawrence's property. 15 pristine acres with unobstructed valley views. Developers have been after that land for years. I took a sip of coffee. Is that so? Absolutely. Property values in this area have skyrocketed. That parcel could easily fetch 7 figures now. He leaned forward, expression earnest. Which brings me to what I wanted to discuss. Lawrence's estate. Yes, I said carefully. His estate. Eric reached for a folder on a nearby credenza. I have his will here. It's straightforward, really. He left everything to me with the understanding that I'd handle things appropriately. He slid a document across the table. You can read it if you like, though. There's not much to see. I glanced at the paper. Dated 4 years ago, it indeed left Lawrence's entire estate to Eric as sole beneficiary. I made a show of studying it, then looked up. When did he sign this? 4 years ago, after Dad died. Eric replied smoothly. He updated all his affairs then. I see. I took another sip of coffee. And he never updated it since? Even when his health began. Failing? Something flickered in Eric's eyes. Caution. No. Why would he? I shrugged. People often review their wills when their circumstances change. I just wondered. Lawrence was a creature of habit, Eric said dismissively. Once he made up his mind, that was that. Like his mind was made up about never selling his mountain property? I asked innocently. Eric's cup paused halfway to his lips. He was sentimental about that land, yes, but he was also practical. He understood its value. Interesting, I said. because I always got the impression that land was sacred to him, that he wanted it preserved, not developed. Eric's smile tightened. Well, we all heard what we wanted to hear from Lawrence. He was rather private about his true intentions. Was he? I reached into my bag and pulled out Caroline's folder. Because I have here copies of letters he wrote to me in the months before he died. Letters I never received, and they tell a rather different story. The color drained from Eric's face so quickly I thought he might faint. He set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. What are you talking about? His voice had lost its smooth, confident tone. I laid out the photocopied letters, one by one. These, written by Uncle Lawrence, addressed to me, describing how you were pressuring him to sell his land to developers, how he wanted me to have the property instead because I'd preserve it, how he was afraid you might do something drastic. Eric's expression cycled rapidly through shock, confusion, and anger, before settling into cold calculation. Where did you get these? Marlene Pitts had copies, I said, watching him carefully. Uncle Lawrence gave them to her for safekeeping. He was worried the originals might disappear. Eric barked a laugh, but it sounded hollow. And you believe that old woman? She's clearly confused, Sandra, possibly suffering from dementia. Lawrence and I discussed the property extensively. He wanted it developed. It was his retirement plan. Then explain this, I said, placing the photocopied will on the table. A will executed and notarized just 3 months ago, leaving the property specifically to me, with explicit instructions that it not be developed. Eric's face hardened. That's a forgery. Obviously. Is it? Because the notary who witnessed it is willing to testify otherwise, as is the attorney who drafted it. I leaned forward. And then there's the matter of what you burned behind Grace Chapel the night before the funeral. He went very still. I don't know what you're talking about. I pulled out my phone, showing him the photos I'd taken of the charred documents. These fragments, in Uncle Lawrence's handwriting, found in the trash bin where Marlene Pitts saw you burning papers. This is absurd, Eric hissed, but his confidence was cracking. You're constructing some elaborate conspiracy theory based on the ramblings of an old woman who barely knew Lawrence and a few random scraps of paper. Then you won't mind if we let the probate court sort it out, I said. Caroline Desmond, my attorney, filed for an emergency injunction this morning. Any transactions regarding Uncle Lawrence's property are frozen pending investigation. Eric shot to his feet, sending his chair crashing backward. You had no right. I had every right, I replied, staying seated, keeping my voice level. Uncle Lawrence tried to reach me. You intercepted his communications. You destroyed his legal documents. You lied about his wishes. That's criminal, Eric. He began pacing, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. You don't understand what's at stake here. I've already signed preliminary agreements with Blue Sky Development. Millions of dollars, Sandra. We could split it. Both benefit. It's not about the money, I said quietly. It's about honoring what he wanted. Eric laughed bitterly. Honor doesn't pay bills. That property sitting untouched helps no one. It helps preserve what Uncle Lawrence loved, what he fought for. Fought for? Eric sneered. He was a broken old man who came back from Vietnam with more demons than medals. That land was his hiding place, nothing more. I stood then, gathering my documents. I think we're done here. If you do this, Eric said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, if you challenge the will I've submitted, I'll fight you with everything I have. I'll drag Lawrence's name through the mud if I have to. Claim he wasn't competent, that he was manipulated by Marlene, by you. I looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered how I'd never seen the stranger behind my brother's eyes before. That's the difference between us, Eric, I said softly. I'm fighting to protect Uncle Lawrence's legacy. You're willing to destroy it. His face contorted with rage. Get out of my house. I walked to the door, then turned back one last time. For what it's worth, I would have shared the property with you, if you'd just been honest. Honesty is a luxury, he spat. One I can't afford. As I drove away, I felt oddly calm. The confrontation had gone almost exactly as Caroline had predicted. We had what we needed, Eric's implicit admission, his knowledge of the later will, his confession about the development deals he'd already initiated. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since arriving in Asheville, I felt certain I was doing the right thing. What I didn't know then was how desperate Eric would become, or how far he would go to keep what he believed was rightfully his. The legal proceedings began with clinical efficiency. Caroline filed our formal challenge to the will Eric had submitted, including affidavits from Marlene Pitts and the notary who had witnessed Uncle Lawrence's true final will. The court ordered all assets frozen pending investigation and set a hearing date for the following month. Eric, true to his word, fought back viciously. He hired Griffin and Mercer, the most expensive law firm in Asheville, and immediately filed a counter-motion claiming Uncle Lawrence had been of diminished capacity when he signed the later will, that he had been unduly influenced by Marlene Pitts, and, most painfully, that I had orchestrated the entire scheme to defraud my brother of his rightful inheritance. Standard tactics, Caroline assured me when I showed her the filing, my hands shaking with anger. They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, but we have facts on our side. I wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at me. Eric had resources I didn't. Money, connections, a ruthless determination I was only beginning to comprehend. 3 days after our confrontation, I returned to my in-room to find the door slightly ajar. Nothing seemed missing, but everything felt disturbed, as if someone had carefully examined my possessions and replaced them just slightly wrong. The original fragment of burned letter I'd saved from the trash bin was gone from its hiding place in my suitcase lining. That night, Marlene called me, her voice trembling. "Someone broke into the shop," she said. "Didn't take the register money, just tore apart my office. The copies Lawrence gave me, I kept them in a false bottom in my desk drawer. They're gone." A cold dread settled in my stomach. "Did you call the police?" "Yes, but what can they do? Nothing was really stolen except papers that legally weren't even mine." She paused. "Sandra, I'm scared. This morning, a man came in, said he was from the health department, started asking questions about my business license, looking for violations. Then Eric's lawyer called, said they're planning to depose me next week, investigate my mental competency." I closed my eyes, fighting a wave of nausea. "I'm so sorry, Marlene. This is my fault." "No," she said firmly. "It's Eric's fault. Lawrence saw what he was becoming. That's why he changed his will." After we hung up, I called Caroline and told her about both break-ins. "Document everything," she instructed. "Take photos of your room. File a police report. We can request security footage from the inn." She hesitated. "And Sandra? Maybe it's time to consider moving to more secure accommodations. I have a client with a guest house on a gated property. Very private." "You think Eric would actually—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "I think 7 figures in real estate development deals create powerful motivations," she replied carefully. "Better safe than sorry." I moved to the guest house that evening, not telling anyone my new location except Caroline. It was a lovely little cottage nestled in a wooded area on the edge of a sprawling estate, completely hidden from the road. For the first time in days, I slept soundly. The next morning, Caroline called, with unexpected news. "The court granted our motion for expedited discovery," she said, excitement in her voice. "We can depose Eric next week and demand all correspondence between him and any developers regarding the property." "That's good, right?" "Very good. His attorneys will coach him, of course. But if he's been negotiating development deals while Lawrence was still alive, especially without Lawrence's knowledge or consent, what about the missing evidence?" I asked. "The original fragment? Marlene's copies? Concerning, but not fatal to our case. We still have your photographs, and the notary's testimony about the original will. Plus, these break-ins strengthen our narrative that Eric is actively attempting to suppress evidence." I spent the next few days preparing for Eric's deposition with Caroline, reviewing Uncle Lawrence's letters, and visiting the mountain property that had become the center of this conflict. The land was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. 15 acres of pristine forest on a gentle slope, culminating in a breathtaking vista overlooking the valley. An old cabin sat nestled among towering pines, its weathered wood blending perfectly with the natural surroundings. Inside, everything remained untouched. Lawrence's old army footlocker, the handmade rocking chair on the porch, the collection of nature books lining rough-hewn shelves. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it held a peaceful dignity that no glass and steel mansion could match. Standing on the cabin porch, watching the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, I finally understood what we were really fighting for. This wasn't just property, it was legacy, memory, a piece of a good man's soul captured in 15 acres of unspoiled beauty. I took a deep breath of pine-scented air and made a silent promise to Uncle Lawrence that I wouldn't let this place be carved up and commercialized. Not while I had breath in my body. The day before Eric's deposition, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Malone? A man's voice, unfamiliar. My name is Thomas Weaver. I was your uncle's nurse at Pinecrest Nursing Home for the last 6 months of his life. My heart quickened. Yes? I've been following the court case in the papers, he said hesitantly. There's something you should know. Something I witnessed. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, public, well-lit, with plenty of people around. Thomas Weaver turned out to be a young man, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a serious demeanor. I shouldn't be telling you this, he said after we'd sat down with our coffees. Patient confidentiality and all, but it doesn't seem right to stay silent. What is it? I asked, trying to keep the desperation from my voice. Thomas glanced around, then leaned forward. Your brother visited Lawrence often toward the end. The visits always left your uncle agitated. Once I came in right as Eric was leaving, and Lawrence was in tears. He kept saying, "She needs to know. Sandra needs to know." I felt a lump form in my throat. Did he say what I needed to know? Thomas nodded. That he'd changed his will. That the property was meant for you. That Eric was trying to force him to sign some kind of amendment or reversal. He hesitated. There's more. The last time your brother visited, he took Lawrence's personal effects. Said he was organizing them. When I checked later, Lawrence's writing desk had been cleaned out. All his papers were gone. I stared at him, processing this new information. Would you be willing to sign an affidavit about what you saw and heard? Thomas looked uncomfortable but resolute. Yes, it's the right thing to do. As we parted ways, he touched my arm. Your uncle talked about you a lot, you know. Said you were the only one who understood why that land mattered. I barely made it back to my car before the tears came. Not just grief for Uncle Lawrence, but for the family I'd thought I had. The brother I'd believed in despite our differences. That night, as I was reviewing my notes for Eric's deposition, my phone pinged with an email notification. From Eric. The subject line read simply, "We need to talk." The message contained no text, just an attachment. A photograph of Uncle Lawrence's cabin, with fresh tire tracks leading to the door, and a red gasoline canister sitting on the porch. My blood ran cold as I stared at the photo. The threat couldn't have been clearer if Eric had spelled it out. Back off, or the cabin burns. I immediately called Caroline, my voice shaking as I forwarded her the email. This is a direct threat, she said, her normally composed tone edged with alarm. We need to contact the sheriff immediately. I'm going to the cabin, I told her, already grabbing my keys. He might already be there. Sandra, no, Caroline insisted. This is exactly what he wants, to lure you out there alone. Let the authorities handle this. But I couldn't wait. Something primal and protective had awakened in me, a fierce determination to shield the last physical connection I had to Uncle Lawrence. While Caroline contacted the sheriff, I sped toward the mountain property, rain beginning to spatter against my windshield as a summer storm rolled in across the peaks. The narrow access road to the cabin was slick with mud, forcing me to navigate carefully despite my urgency. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in stark, ghostly bursts. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, rain was falling in sheets, drumming against the roof of my car. Pulled up behind a vehicle I recognized with sickening clarity. Eric's black BMW, its sleek surface gleaming wetly in another flash of lightning. Through the downpour, I could make out a figure on the cabin porch, silhouetted against the warm light spilling from inside. Grabbing an umbrella from my back seat, I stepped out into the storm. The wind immediately tore the umbrella inside out, rendering it useless. I dropped it and ran toward the cabin, soaked to the skin within seconds. "Eric!" I shouted over the roar of the rain. "What are you doing?" He turned, and I was startled by the haggard transformation of his usually impeccable appearance. His hair was disheveled, his expensive clothes rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. "You came," he said, his voice oddly calm. "I wasn't sure you would." "Where's the gas can?" I demanded, looking around frantically. "Eric, whatever you're thinking, this isn't the answer." He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that sent chills through me despite the warm summer rain. "Always so dramatic, Sandra. Come inside. We need to talk." Every instinct screamed that entering the cabin with him was dangerous, but the alternative, leaving him alone there with whatever destructive plans he harbored, seemed worse. I followed him inside, my shoes squelching on the wooden floor. The cabin's interior was just as I remembered. Rustic, warm, filled with simple furniture and Uncle Lawrence's modest possessions. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The red gasoline can from the photo sat ominously on the kitchen table. "I knew this would get your attention," Eric said, gesturing toward it. "Though I have to admit, I did consider it, burning it all down, starting fresh." He sank into Lawrence's old rocking chair. "Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed for this family, Sandra? What I've endured?" I kept my distance, positioning myself near the door. "Is that how you justify all this? Your sacrifices entitle you to take what isn't yours? Isn't mine?" Eric's voice rose sharply. "I stayed. When you left for college, when Dad got sick, when the business was failing. I stayed. I worked 80-hour weeks. I nursed Dad through his final months while you sent occasional phone calls from your comfortable life in Raleigh." "That's not fair," I protested, but the old guilt surfaced nonetheless. "Dad made it clear he wanted you to take over the business, not me. Because I was here." Eric slammed his fist against the arm of the chair. "I was the dutiful son, the responsible one. And my reward? A failing furniture company with outdated equipment and mounting debt." I stared at him, realization dawning. "You're in financial trouble." He laughed again, that same hollow sound. "The business has been operating in the red for 2 years. The pandemic, supply chain issues, rising costs. I've been keeping it afloat with personal loans, mortgaging everything I own." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "This land is my last chance, Sandra. The blue sky deal would clear my debts and save Dad's legacy." "By destroying Uncle Lawrence's legacy?" I asked quietly. Eric's expression hardened. "Lawrence never cared about Dad's business, never invested a dime. Just sat up here in his little hermit cabin while I fought to keep the Malone name alive in Asheville." "That's not true," I said. "He offered to help you many times. You refused." "Help?" Eric scoffed. "He wanted to sell the downtown showroom, the heart of the business, and downsize to some soulless warehouse space. That wasn't help. It was surrender." Thunder crashed outside, rattling the cabin windows. In the momentary silence that followed, I heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Eric heard it too. His head snapped up. "Who did you call?" "The sheriff," I admitted, "after you sent that threatening email." He stood abruptly, moving toward the gasoline can. My heart leapt into my throat, but instead of grabbing it, he picked up a thick envelope that had been lying beneath it. "I didn't come here to burn anything," he said, his voice suddenly weary. "I came to give you this." He held out the envelope. When I hesitated, he tossed it onto the coffee table between us. "What is it?" I asked cautiously. "The original will. Lawrence's letters to you. Everything I took." He sank back into the chair. "I'm withdrawing my challenge. The land is yours." I stared at him in disbelief. "Just like that? Why?" Eric looked into the fire, his profile sharp against the dancing flames. "Thomas Weaver called me after he met with you, told me what he was planning to testify about." He gave a mirthless smile. "Turns out there's a line even I won't cross. Perjury in a probate case when a credible witness can contradict me? That's the line." Cautiously, I opened the envelope. Inside were all the original documents. Uncle Lawrence's final will, his letters to me, even notes he'd made about his conversations with Eric regarding the property. "The development deal is dead anyway," Eric continued flatly. "Once Blue Sky heard about the court case, they pulled out. Said they didn't need the negative publicity of a family dispute." The sound of vehicles outside grew louder, then stopped. Car doors slammed. "You used that gas can to scare me," I said, anger rising despite my relief. "To manipulate me into coming out here alone." "Yes," he admitted without remorse. "I needed to see you in person, away from the lawyers, needed you to understand what's at stake. And now?" Before he could answer, there was a pounding at the door. "Sheriff's Department. Open up." I moved to the door and pulled it open. Sheriff Mills stood on the porch, rain dripping from his hat brim, 2 deputies behind him. "Ms. Malone," he said, recognition in his eyes. "We got a call about a threatening situation." "It's been resolved," I said, glancing back at Eric, who remained motionless in the rocking chair. "My brother and I were just having a discussion." The sheriff looked past me skeptically. "That true, Mr. Malone?" Eric nodded without turning. "Just a family matter, Sheriff. Sorry for the trouble." Sheriff Mills didn't look convinced. "Mind if we take a look around? Make sure everything's secure?" While the deputies checked the perimeter, the sheriff examined the gasoline can, which turned out to be empty, a prop in Eric's theatrical threat. "You sure you don't want to file a report?" he asked me quietly. That email he sent could constitute a criminal threat. I looked at Eric, defeated, diminished, sitting in our uncle's chair, and made a decision I hoped I wouldn't regret. No report, but thank you for coming out in this weather. After the sheriff and his deputies left, an uncomfortable silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackling fire and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. "What happens now?" I finally asked. Eric stood, moving toward the door. "Now I go back to Asheville and try to salvage what's left of the business. File for bankruptcy, probably. Sell the house. Start over." As he reached for the doorknob, I found myself saying, "Wait." He paused, not turning. "Uncle Lawrence's letters. Have you read them all?" "Yes," he said quietly. "Then you know he suggested a solution for the business." Eric turned, confusion crossing his face. "What?" I pulled out one of the letters, the one dated just 2 weeks before Lawrence died. He proposed using part of this land, just 3 acres at the base of the property, near the access road, as the site for a showroom. Malone Craftsman. Furniture, where the materials are sourced from the same mountains as the artistry. That was his vision. Eric took the letter, reading it with furrowed brow. "This would never generate enough to cover the debts. Maybe not immediately," I acknowledged. "But it's a fresh start. A way to honor both legacies, Dad's craftsmanship and Uncle Lawrence's love of this land." He looked up at me, suspicion in his eyes. "Why would you offer this, after everything I've done?" I thought about it for a moment, rain pattering against the windows. "Because we're still family, and because I think it's what Uncle Lawrence would have wanted." Eric folded the letter carefully, his hands steadier than they'd been all evening. "I'll think about it." As he walked out into the rain toward his car, I stood in the doorway of the cabin that was now undisputedly mine, watching my brother, this complex, flawed person I'd grown up with but never truly known, disappear into the stormy night. I didn't know if we would ever rebuild what had been broken between us, but as the rain began to ease and the first stars appeared in breaks between the clouds, I felt something I hadn't expected, the possibility of healing. The formal withdrawal of Eric's challenge to the will came 3 days later, a terse legal document that acknowledged Lawrence's final testament as valid and relinquished all claims to the mountain property. Caroline was stunned. "I've never seen such a complete reversal," she said as we sat in her office reviewing the paperwork. "No conditions, no partial settlements, just capitulation." I didn't tell her about the cabin confrontation, about the empty gas can, or the rain-soaked conversation that had changed everything. Some moments between family members needed to remain private, even from legal counsel. "Let's just say Eric found his conscience," I replied. Caroline raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, whatever happened, this simplifies things considerably. The court should confirm your ownership within weeks rather than months." As I signed the necessary documents, a weight lifted, not just the burden of the legal battle, but something deeper, a sense that Uncle Lawrence could finally rest in peace, knowing his wishes would be honored. That afternoon, I drove to Marlene's flower shop, bearing news of the resolution and a small peace offering, a jar of wild Anne. Honey from Lawrence's property, something he used to bring her regularly. The bell jingled as I entered, but the shop was empty. Display cases that had once brimmed with vibrant blooms stood bare. A handwritten sign on the counter read, "Closing sale, all stock, 50% off." Marlene emerged from the back room, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Sandra, I was hoping you'd stop by." I handed her the ice, honey, and told her the news about Eric's withdrawal. Relief flooded her features, but the sadness lingered in her eyes. "I'm so glad," she said, setting the honey jar carefully on the counter. "Lawrence would be at peace knowing you'll watch over his special place." I gestured at the empty shelves. "What's happening here?" She sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "It's time, dear. I've been running this shop for 43 years. My arthritis gets worse every winter, and after everything that's happened." She trailed off, looking around at the shop with fond resignation. "Some battles remind you of the war you've been fighting too long." "I'm so sorry," I said, guilt washing over me. "If I hadn't involved you in all this—" "Nonsense," she interrupted firmly. "I involved myself because it was right. Lawrence was my friend. More than a friend, truth be told." She moved to a small workstation behind the counter and opened a drawer, removing a faded photograph. In it, a much younger Marlene stood beside an equally young Lawrence, both in hiking gear, standing atop what I recognized as the ridge behind his cabin. They were holding hands, laughing into the camera. "We were in love once," she said softly, tracing the outline of Lawrence's face with her fingertip, "after he came back from Vietnam. But he was broken in ways neither of us understood then. PTSD, they call it now. Back then, we just knew he would wake up screaming, that crowds made him panic, that he couldn't bear to be touched sometimes." I stared at the photo, seeing my uncle in a completely new light. "I had no idea. He ended things between us," Marlene continued. "Said he couldn't burden me with his demons. Bought that mountain property to isolate himself where his nightmares wouldn't frighten anyone else." Her eyes misted over. "I married Frank Pitts 2 years later. A good man, kind, stable. We had 30 happy years before cancer took him." "And Lawrence? Did you stay in touch?" She nodded. "Always. As friends. He'd bring me honey from his bees. I'd send flowers on his birthday. When Frank passed, Lawrence started visiting more regularly, having coffee here after closing time, walking in the botanical gardens." "Were you in love with him all those years?" I asked gently. Marlene smiled, a private, gentle expression. "Some loves change shape, dear, but never really leave you. We were companions in our golden years. Never lived together, never even spoke of romance again. But we understood each other." She carefully returned the photo to its drawer. "That's why I knew something was wrong when he started talking about Eric's visits, about the pressure he felt. Lawrence wasn't a man who scared easily, but he was frightened in those final months. I thought about the quiet, stoic uncle I'd known, imagining the complex life he'd led beyond my limited understanding. His war trauma, his sacrificed love, his solitary existence punctuated by quiet connection with Marlene. "What will you do now?" I asked. "After the shop closes?" "My daughter's been pestering me to move to Charlotte, be closer to the grandkids." She chuckled. "Might be time to let her win that argument." An idea began forming in my mind, nebulous at first, then taking clearer shape. "The cabin on Lawrence's property. It's going to sit empty most of the time while I'm in Raleigh." Marlene looked up, a question in her eyes. "It needs someone who knew him, who loved the land like he did," I continued. "Someone to keep an eye on things, maybe plant flowers around that sad excuse for a garden he called a yard." "Sandra," she said cautiously, "what are you suggesting?" "Stay," I said simply. "Live in the cabin, be its caretaker. I can't think of anyone Uncle Lawrence would rather have watching over his special place." Tears welled in Marlene's eyes. "I couldn't possibly, not as a tenant," I clarified, "as family. The cabin needs life in it, Marlene. It needs someone who understands its history, its importance." She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her pocket. "You're sure?" "Absolutely," I said, surprising myself with how right it felt. "Uncle Lawrence would have wanted you there. I want you there." 2 weeks later, I helped Marlene move into the cabin. We spent a weekend arranging her belongings alongside Lawrence's, creating a space that honored both their histories. She transformed the barren patch of dirt he'd optimistically called a garden into a riot of native wildflowers and herbs. Inside, her feminine touches, colorful quilts, watercolor paintings, vases filled with fresh blooms, softened the cabin's rustic masculinity without diminishing it. On the evening before I was to return to Raleigh, we sat on the porch in rocking chairs, watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass as twilight descended. "I've been thinking about your idea," Marlene said after a comfortable silence. "Using part of the property for Eric's furniture showroom." I nodded. "I mentioned it to him, but I haven't heard back. I'm not sure he's ready to accept help, especially from me." "Men and their pride," she said with a knowing smile. Lawrence was the same. But I think it's a wonderful idea, a compromise that honors both brothers. If Eric ever comes around," I said, doubt creeping into my voice. "He will," Marlene said confidently. "Sooner than you think." She was right. The next morning, as I was loading my car for the drive back to Raleigh, a familiar black BMW appeared on the access road. Eric emerged, looking more composed than he had during our rainy confrontation, but still lacking his former polished arrogance. He nodded to Marlene, who tactfully excused herself inside, then approached me with cautious formality. "I've been thinking about your proposal," he said without preamble. "The showroom idea, Lawrence's vision, and," I prompted when he fell silent. "I'd like to pursue it," he said, meeting my eyes directly. If the offer still stands. Relief and something like hope fluttered in my chest. It does. I've spoken with a local architect, he continued, his voice gaining confidence. Someone who specializes in sustainable building design. The concept would be minimal disruption to the land, a structure that blends with the environment rather than imposing on it. That sounds perfect, I said genuinely, impressed by how much thought he'd already given it. There's more, Eric said, reaching into his jacket pocket. I found these while cleaning out my office. He handed me a small stack of photographs, faded color prints from the late 1980s. They showed a teenage version of myself sitting with Uncle Lawrence on the cabin porch, both of us concentrating on whittling small wooden figures. Dad took these, Eric explained. During that summer, you stayed with Lawrence while Mom and Dad were in Europe. I remembered that summer vividly. 3 months of quiet companionship with my uncle, learning to fish, to identify bird calls, to carve simple shapes from fallen branches. It had been the most peaceful time of my turbulent adolescence. Thank you, I said, running my finger over the images. I didn't know these existed. Eric shuffled uncomfortably. There's something else I need to tell you, about Lawrence, about why I was so determined to develop this land. I waited, sensing his struggle to find the right words. It wasn't just about the money, he finally said. It was about erasing him, his influence, his judgment. Judgment? I echoed, confused. Eric looked away toward the eye. Mountains. He knew what I was becoming, Sandra. The man I was turning into. Every time I visited, I could see the disappointment in his eyes, the silent comparison to Dad. His voice grew tight. I wanted to bulldoze this place because every inch of it reminded me of how far I'd fallen from the person I was supposed to be. The raw honesty of his confession left me momentarily speechless. This was a version of my brother I'd never seen before. Vulnerable, self-aware, stripped of pretense. It's not too late to be that person again, I said quietly. He met my gaze, skepticism warring with hope in his eyes. You really believe that? I do, I said firmly. And so would Uncle Lawrence. The transformation began slowly, like most meaningful changes do. Eric and I established a tentative partnership to develop the small section of land for the new showroom. We agreed on 3 acres at the base of the property, where the access road met the county highway, visible enough for business purposes, but far enough from the cabin to preserve its peaceful isolation. I took a leave of absence from my job in Raleigh, renting a small apartment in Asheville to oversee the project and spend more time at the cabin with Marlene. My principal had been surprisingly understanding when I'd explained the situation. Family land is sacred, she'd said, signing my leave paperwork. My grandmother's farm saved our family during the Depression. Some things are worth taking time for. Eric introduced me to Layla Chavez, the sustainable architect he'd mentioned. She was a dynamic woman in her 40s, with silver-streaked black hair and a portfolio full of stunning designs that seemed to grow organically from their surroundings rather than imposing upon them. The key, she explained as we walked the property one crisp September morning, is to let the land tell us what belongs here, not force our vision onto it. Her philosophy resonated deeply with me, and I could see that even Eric was affected by her passionate respect for the natural world. The hardened businessman I'd confronted just months earlier now listened attentively as Layla pointed out how the structure could be positioned to minimize tree removal and maximize natural light. What about materials? Eric asked, making notes in a small leather journal, something I'd never seen him do before. We should use local sources, right? Layla nodded approvingly. Absolutely. And perhaps incorporate wood from the property itself, selectively harvested, of course. There are several mature oaks that will need to be cleared for the foundation. Their lumber could become showcases for your furniture. Lawrence would have liked that, I said quietly. Using what the land offers, not taking more than needed. Eric glanced at me, something unreadable flickering across his face. Yes, he would have. Later that afternoon, as Layla spread preliminary sketches across the cabin's kitchen table, Marlene brought us fresh-baked scones and coffee. It struck me how strange yet natural this gathering felt. My estranged brother, my uncle's former love, and a woman who is helping us bridge our divided past, all working together to create something new that honored what came before. What do you think about a living roof? Layla asked, pointing to one of her renderings. Native grasses and wildflowers, with a rainwater collection system that feeds into a small reflecting pool at the entrance. Beautiful, Marlene murmured, examining the sketch. Like the building is wearing a crown of what surrounds it. Eric was studying. The structural elements, his brow furrowed in concentration. The timber frame design. It reminds me of the antique barns Dad used to salvage wood from when we were kids. That's exactly the inspiration, Layla confirmed. Appalachian timber framing techniques, updated with modern engineering. It's sturdy but graceful, and the exposed beams showcase the natural beauty of the wood, perfect for a furniture showroom. As the weeks passed, our planning sessions became more frequent, and with each meeting, the tension between Eric and me eased incrementally. We still disagreed, often vigorously, but the fundamental animosity had begun to dissolve, replaced by a cautious mutual respect. October painted the mountains in brilliant hues of amber, crimson, and gold. We broke ground on the showroom, site with a small ceremony, just the four of us, plus Thomas Weaver, who had become a friend since his courageous decision to speak up about Uncle Lawrence's final days. To new beginnings, Eric said, turning the first shovelful of earth, and to honoring what came before. It wasn't a grand public declaration of remorse, but coming from my brother, who had always valued appearances above authenticity, those simple words carried profound significance. The construction progressed steadily through the fall. Eric threw himself into the project with unexpected passion, often arriving before the work crews to walk the site alone in the early morning mist. One day, I found him standing amidst the emerging timber frame, running his hand reverently along a massive oak beam. Dad would have loved this, he said without turning, somehow sensing my presence. Remember how he used to take us to construction sites when we were kids? How he'd explain every joint and connection like he was telling a story? I remember, I said, joining him beneath the soaring rafters. He'd say the wood was still alive, still had stories to tell? Eric nodded, his gaze fixed on the intricate joinery above us. I forgot that part of him. Somewhere along the way, I reduced him to balance sheets and market share. Forgot he was an artist first, businessman second. The business was important to him, I offered. He was proud of what he built. Yes, but not at any cost. Eric's voice held a tinge of bitterness, directed not at me, but at himself. He turned down developers twice when I was running the company with him. Said some clients weren't worth compromising our values for. After he died, I called those same developers back within a month. His candor surprised me. This new Eric, capable of self-reflection and regret, was someone I barely recognized. Yet glimpses of the brother I'd once known and loved occasionally shone through the cracks in his polished facade. As winter descended on the mountains, the showroom took its final shape. Layla's design had exceeded even our highest expectations. The building seemed to emerge from the landscape like a natural formation, its living roof dusted with snow, its stone foundation appearing to grow from the earth itself, its reclaimed timber frame telling the story of the forest around it. The interior featured soaring ceilings with clear story, windows that bathed the space in natural light. A central hearth of riverstone anchored the open floor plan, and built-in display areas showcased Eric's finest pieces, the custom furniture that had once been the heart of Malone craftsmen before the business had drifted toward mass production. In early December, with the major construction complete and only finishing touches remaining, Eric invited me to meet him at the showroom after hours. I arrived to find the space transformed. Soft lighting illuminated each display, a fire crackled in the hearth, and classical guitar music played softly from hidden speakers. Eric stood in the center of the room, dressed not in his usual business attire, but in jeans and a flannel shirt, looking more like our father than I'd ever seen him. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing around the space with unmistakable pride. "It's magnificent," I said honestly. "Everything we hoped for, and more." He nodded, then motioned for me to follow him to a section that had been covered with a drop cloth. "I wanted to show you something, a new piece I've been working on." With a somewhat ceremonial gesture, he pulled away the cloth to reveal a writing desk of extraordinary beauty, crafted from figured maple with walnut inlays, its lines both contemporary and timeless. "You made this?" I asked, running my fingers over the flawless finish. "Yes," he said, a hint of bashfulness in his voice. "First piece I've built myself in, well, probably 15 years, since Dad got sick." I opened one of the drawers. It slid with perfect precision, revealing an interior lined with aromatic cedar. "It's extraordinary, Eric. It's for you," he said quietly. For the cabin. I noticed you writing in journals when you visit, but you don't have a proper desk. I looked up at him, momentarily speechless. The gift itself was magnificent, but the thoughtfulness behind it, the observation of my habits, the personal craftsmanship, moved me deeply. Thank you. I finally managed, my voice thick with emotion. He nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the sentiment hanging in the air. Typical Eric. Even the new, improved version had his limits with emotional expression. There's something else I wanted to discuss, he said, moving toward two chairs positioned near the hearth. A business proposition. I joined him by the fire, curious. What kind of proposition? A partnership, he said. Malone Heritage Furniture, a new company built around the principles Lawrence and Dad shared. Craftsmanship, sustainability, connection to these mountains. You want me as a partner? I asked, genuinely surprised. Eric, I don't know anything about furniture manufacturing or running a business. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. But you know everything? About what makes this place special, about the legacy we're trying to preserve. He leaned forward earnestly. I'm not asking you to quit your job or move back permanently, just to be the conscience of the company, to help ensure we never lose sight of why we're doing this. As the fire crackled and snow began to fall outside the wall of windows, I considered his offer. 6 months ago, the idea of going into business with Eric would have seemed absurd, dangerous even. But the man sitting across from me now, illuminated by firelight, was not the same brother who had tried to destroy our uncle's final wishes. I'd need to think about it, I said carefully. Of course, he replied, no hint of pressure in his voice. Take all the time you need. As I drove back to the cabin that night, snow swirling in my headlights, I realized something profound had shifted, not just between Eric and me, but within me. The anger and resentment that had fueled my initial fight for Uncle Lawrence's property had transformed into something more constructive, more healing. I was no longer just preserving the past. I was helping build a future. Christmas arrived with a perfect blanket of snow across the mountains. I had extended my leave of absence through the new year, unable to tear myself away from the evolving story unfolding in Asheville. My small apartment in town remained mostly unused as I spent more and more time at the cabin with Marlene, whose grandmotherly warmth had filled the space with an atmosphere Uncle Lawrence's solitary existence never quite achieved. You're coming for Christmas dinner, right? I asked Eric during a phone call a few days before the holiday. Marlene's making her famous prime rib, and I've been instructed to tell you that refusal is not an option. He laughed, a sound I was still getting used to hearing from him. Wouldn't miss it. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, I said, then added, and maybe some of that bourbon you've been hiding in your desk drawer. How did you? He began, then chuckled. Marlene told you, didn't she? She's worse than the Asheville gossip column. She mentioned you'd developed a taste for the finer things in life, I admitted. Said Uncle Lawrence would approve of your selection, if not your habit of drinking alone. There was a small pause. I'm working on that part, he said quietly. Christmas Eve brought a gentle snowfall that transformed the property into something from a storybook. Marlene and I spent the day baking, the cabin filled with the aromas of cinnamon, vanilla, and pine from the small tree we'd decorated in the corner of the living room. Lawrence never had a Christmas tree, Marlene commented as she crimped the edge of a pie crust. Said it seemed wasteful to cut down a perfectly good tree just to watch it die in your living room. That sounds like him, I laughed, practical to a fault. But he loved Christmas lights, she continued, a faraway look in her eyes. Every year he'd string them along the porch railing, said they reminded him of stars, and stars reminded him there were bigger things in the universe than human problems. I glanced out the window at the porch railing, now adorned with the white lights we'd hung the previous weekend. I think he'd approve of our compromise. An artificial tree inside, real lights outside. Marlene wiped her hands on her apron, leaving traces of flour. He'd approve of a lot that's happening here now, Sandra. The showroom, you and Eric finding your way back to being family, this old cabin having life in it. Again, she met my eyes with unexpected intensity. He believed in renewal, in second chances. Vietnam took that from him for many years, but he found his way back to it eventually. That evening, as twilight descended and the Christmas lights twinkled against the snow, I bundled up and walked to the ridge overlook, a flat outcropping of rock where Uncle Lawrence had built a simple wooden bench. It was his favorite spot on the property, offering a panoramic view of the valley below and mountains beyond. The air was crystalline, cold and sharp in my lungs, the snow crunching beneath my boots. As I settled onto the bench, brushing away a dusting of snow, an unexpected wave of emotion washed over me. For the first time since the funeral, I truly grieved for Uncle Lawrence, not for the legal battle his death had precipitated, but for the quiet, complex man himself. "I wish you could see this," I said aloud, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I wish you could know that it all worked out in the end." The wind whispered through the evergreens behind me, and for a moment, I could almost imagine it was his voice. Soft, measured, saying more with silence than most people managed, with words. I'm not typically prone to supernatural thinking, but sitting there in the gathering darkness, I felt a profound sense of connection. To Lawrence, to the land, to something larger than myself. Whether it was his spirit or simply the memories this place held, I couldn't say, but the certainty that I had done right by him settled deep in my bones, warming me despite the cold. When I returned to the cabin, rosy-cheeked and contemplative, I found Marlene adding the final touches to a wreath of evergreen boughs and pine cones. "Perfect timing," she said, hanging the wreath on the cabin door. "There's hot chocolate on the stove, and I've just taken the gingerbread out of the oven." Later, as we sat by the fire with our mugs of cocoa, Marlene revealed something that shifted my understanding of Uncle Lawrence yet again. "He left you letters," she said, setting down her mug. "Not just the ones about the property and Eric. Others, personal ones. He wrote them over the years, never intending to send them." My heart quickened. "What kind of letters?" She rose and went to her bedroom, returning with a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl, an object I'd noticed on her dresser but assumed was her own. "This was Lawrence's," she explained, setting it on the coffee table between us. "He gave it to me 2 weeks before he passed. Said if anything happened to him, I should wait for the right time to give it to you." I stared at the box, hesitant to open it. "And you think now is the right time?" Marlene nodded, her eyes gentle. "Christmas was always when Lawrence felt closest to family, even when he spent it alone. And I think you're ready now." With slightly trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each labeled with a date spanning the last 20 years. Not addressed or stamped, never meant to be mailed, just dated in Uncle Lawrence's precise handwriting. "I'll give you some privacy," Marlene said, squeezing my shoulder as she rose. "Take all the time you need." After she'd retired to her room, I began reading, starting with the earliest letter. Dated shortly after my high school graduation, it congratulated me on my accomplishment and expressed how proud he was, though he'd been unable to attend the ceremony due to what he described as one of my bad spells. A reference, I now understood, to his PTSD episodes. Letter TUS. After letter documented moments in my life from his perspective, my college graduation, which he had attended sitting quietly in the back, my first teaching job, holidays and birthdays where he'd been present, but characteristically reserved. He wrote about watching me grow into a woman of conviction and kindness, qualities he attributed more to my natural character than any influence from our family. There were gaps in the chronology, months or sometimes years when his demons had evidently overwhelmed him, but he always resumed, picking up the narrative thread of my life as observed through his distant but loving eyes. The most recent letter, dated just 1 month before his death, contained a passage that brought tears streaming down my face. "I've never told you how much our summer together changed me, Sandra. When your parents sent you to stay while they traveled, I was terrified. What did I know about caring for a teenage girl? But those 3 months taught me that connection was still possible for me. Your patience with my silences, your delight in the simple beauty of these mountains, your acceptance of my broken parts without trying to fix them, you showed me a way back to humanity that I thought Vietnam had permanently blocked. I've lived a solitary life by necessity, not preference. The war left me unfit for normal relationships, normal family life, but in my own limited way, I've loved you as if you were my daughter. And in protecting this land for you, I hope I'm giving you not just property, but a sanctuary, a place where the truest parts of yourself can always breathe free." I read until midnight, absorbing this hidden narrative that had run parallel to my understanding of our relationship all these years. When I finally closed the last letter, I felt both drained and filled, as if I'd lost Uncle Lawrence all over again, but simultaneously gained a deeper, truer version of him that I could carry forward. Christmas morning dawned clear and brilliant, sunlight turning the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling spectacle of light. Eric arrived promptly at 11, bearing not only the requested bourbon but also carefully wrapped presents and a folder of documents I didn't immediately recognize. Our Christmas dinner was simple but perfect. Marlene's prime rib, roasted vegetables from her final garden harvest, preserved and stored in the yaoi, root cellar, and fresh-baked bread that filled the cabin with its homey aroma. As we lingered over dessert, Marlene's legendary apple pie, Eric slid the folder across the table toward me. "Consider this my real Christmas gift," he said, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice. "Though I did get you an actual present, too." I opened the folder to find legal documents establishing the Lawrence Malone Conservation Trust, a binding covenant that would permanently protect 12 of the 15 acres from development, allowing only the 3 acres we'd already designated for the showroom to be used commercially. "Eric," I breathed, scanning the documents in amazement. "This is insurance," he said simply, "against future weakness, mine or anyone else's. Once filed, these protections can never be removed, even if the property changes hands. The land will remain as Lawrence wanted it, in perpetuity." I looked up at my brother, seeing in his eyes a sincerity I doubted he possessed. "Thank you." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. "It's the right thing to do." Marlene, who had been quietly observing our exchange, raised her glass. "To Lawrence," she said, "who would be proud of you both." We clinked glasses, the 3 of us connected by a man who was no longer present except in the lessons he'd left behind, and the land he'd entrusted to our care. Later, as twilight gathered and we sat contentedly by the fire, I realized something profound had healed, not just between Eric and me, but within each of us individually. The ghosts of past resentments hadn't vanished completely, but they had transformed into something gentler, more instructive. And the gifts exchanged that day went far beyond the wrapped packages beneath our modest tree. We had given each other truth, forgiveness, and the chance to become better versions of ourselves. It was, I thought, as I watched the firelight play across my brother's more relaxed face, exactly what Uncle Lawrence would have wanted for his legacy. Spring came to the mountains with an explosion of wildflowers and renewal. The showroom was complete, its living roof now sprouting tender green shoots that would soon burst into a meadow of native blooms. Inside, Eric had arranged a carefully curated collection of Malone heritage furniture pieces, each one handcrafted using traditional methods and sustainable materials. After much consideration over the winter months, I had accepted Eric's partnership offer, with some modifications. I would remain in my teaching position in Raleigh, coming to Asheville for long weekends and school breaks to handle what we called the legacy aspects of the business: storytelling, education about sustainable forestry, and maintaining the connection between the furniture and the land it came from. Today was the grand opening celebration, and I'd taken a personal day to drive up from Raleigh the night before. The morning had been a flurry of last-minute preparations, arranging refreshments, adjusting lighting, making sure each piece was positioned to best advantage. "Nervous?" I asked Eric as he straightened his tie for the 5th time in as many minutes. "Not nervous," he replied unconvincingly. "Just aware of what's at stake. This isn't just a business launch. It's a redemption story." I squeezed his arm reassuringly. "The invitations were all accepted. People are coming because they want to see what you've created, not to judge your past." He nodded, though the tension remained in his shoulders. After the legal battle over Uncle Lawrence's will had become public knowledge in Asheville's tight-knit business community, Eric had faced significant social and professional fallout. Many former associates had distanced themselves, and rebuilding trust had been a slow, humbling process. The first guests began arriving precisely at noon, a mix of local business leaders, environmental advocates, artisans, and media representatives. Marlene played hostess with natural grace, guiding people through the showroom and sharing anecdotes about Lawrence and the land as if she'd been preparing for this role her entire life. To my surprise, Thomas Weaver arrived with an elderly gentleman I didn't immediately recognize, until he introduced himself as Dr. James Harrington, the former director of Pinecrest Nursing Home. "I had to come see this for myself," Dr. Harrington said, shaking my hand warmly. "Lawrence talked about this land constantly during his time with us, said it was the only place his mind truly found peace. He would have loved what you've done here," Thomas added, gesturing to the thoughtful integration of building and landscape. "It honors him without making it a shrine." As the showroom filled with appreciative murmurs, and the soft clink of champagne glasses, I noticed Eric deep in conversation with Mayor Wilson and several council members, discussing the potential for more sustainable development practices in the region. The tension had finally left his face, replaced by passionate engagement. Leila Chavez, our architect, was conducting impromptu tours, explaining the innovative features of the building, its passive solar design, rainwater collection system, and the locally sourced materials used throughout. This structure uses 60% less energy than conventional commercial buildings of similar size, she informed an impressed group of environmental advocates. And every piece of wood you see has a documented chain of custody ensuring responsible forestry practices. I was Ayaton, speaking with a reporter from the Asheville Citizen-Times when Caroline Desmond, my attorney from the will dispute, appeared at my elbow. Quite a transformation, she said, nodding toward Eric across the room. Both the place and the man. It's been quite a journey, I acknowledged. One I never expected when I first walked into your office. Caroline smiled. In my line of work, family disputes usually end with deeper divisions, not healing. It's refreshing to see an exception. The formal presentation began at 1 o'clock, with Eric taking center stage near the stone hearth. He'd prepared a speech, but set his notes aside as he surveyed the gathered crowd. Thank you all for coming today, he began, his voice steady and sincere. Malone Heritage Furniture represents more than just a business to me, and to my sister Sandra, who has agreed to partner with me in this venture despite having every reason not to. A gentle laugh rippled through the audience, acknowledging the elephant in the room, our very public legal battle. Many of you know that this project was born from conflict, Eric continued, his candor surprising me. From my misguided attempt to develop land that was never meant to be developed. From my failure to honor not just my uncle's wishes, but the soul of this special place. The room had grown completely silent, everyone captivated by this unexpected vulnerability. What you may not know is that this showroom stands on the only 3 acres of a 15-acre property that will ever be developed. The remaining 12 acres have been placed in a permanent conservation trust, ensuring that my uncle's beloved forest and views will remain untouched for generations to come. Approving murmurs and a smattering of applause followed this announcement. Lawrence Malone taught us, that true legacy isn't measured in dollars, but in respect. Respect for craftsmanship, respect for materials, respect for the land. Every piece of furniture created here will embody those principles. Eric turned slightly, gesturing toward the largest furniture display, a magnificent dining table crafted from a single slab of maple, its natural edge preserved, its grain highlighted by skilled hands to reveal patterns like flowing water. This centerpiece was crafted from a tree that stood on this property for over 150 years before succumbing to natural causes last autumn. When we found it fallen after a storm, we didn't see destruction. We saw opportunity, a chance to give new life and purpose to something that had watched over this land since before the Civil War. As he spoke, I found myself blinking back unexpected tears. This eloquent, passionate man seemed worlds away from the coldly calculating brother who had once threatened to burn Uncle Lawrence's cabin. The transformation wasn't just in his words, but in his entire bearing, the corporate mask replaced by authentic purpose. I invite each of you to explore, to touch, to experience the connection between this land and what it has inspired, Eric concluded, and to join us in proving that commerce and conservation can not only coexist, but strengthen each other. The applause was immediate and genuine, and as Eric stepped away from the spotlight, he was immediately surrounded by well-wishers and interested clients. I caught his eye across the room, giving him a subtle thumbs up that made him smile. The event continued well into the afternoon, with many guests lingering to discuss custom commissions or simply to enjoy the ambiance. By the time the last visitors departed, leaving us with a stack of business cards and potential orders, even Eric had to admit the launch had exceeded our most optimistic expectations. Not bad for a reformed villain, he quipped as we collapsed onto a bench by the hearth, physically exhausted but spiritually energized. I prefer character and development, I replied, clinking my water glass against his. Later, as the golden light of early evening filtered through the windows, we walked with Marlene back to the cabin, following the winding path through the forest that connected the 2 structures. The woods were alive with birdsong and the fresh scent of spring growth, and I found myself slowing to absorb the moment. This perfect convergence of past, present, and future. Lawrence would have approved. Marlene said, echoing my thoughts as she often did. All of it. Even forgiving Eric? I asked softly, though my brother had lingered behind us and couldn't hear. Marlene's eyes crinkled with her gentle smile. Especially that part. Lawrence understood better than most that redemption only becomes possible when someone chooses to offer it. As we emerged from the forest into the clearing where the cabin stood, the setting sun illuminated the simple structure with a warm golden glow, not unlike the light I'd seen rekindled in my brother's eyes. Some transformations, I reflected, happen in dramatic moments of crisis, but the most profound ones unfold gradually, almost imperceptibly, like spring returning to a winter-bare forest, one unfurling leaf, one tentative blossom at a time. 1 year later, I stood on the ridge overlook, watching a summer storm roll across the valley below. Lightning flashed in the distant clouds, illuminating their towering forms from within like divine architecture. The air felt charged, electric with possibility, much like my own life had become since that fateful funeral day. So much had changed, yet the essential truth of this place remained constant. The mountains endured, the forests renewed themselves, and the land continued its ancient, patient existence, bearing witness to our human dramas without judgment. The sound of footsteps on the path behind me announced Eric's arrival. He joined me on the bench, slightly out of breath from the climb. "Thought I might find you up here," he said, handing me a steaming mug. "Marlene said to bring you this. It's getting chilly with the storm coming." I accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping my hands around its warmth. "Thanks. Just needed some thinking time before tomorrow." Tomorrow marked the first anniversary of the showroom's opening, and we'd planned a small celebration. Nothing as elaborate as the launch, just a gathering of those who had been instrumental in the journey. More importantly, it was also the day. We would formally announce the Lawrence Malone Scholarship Fund for Sustainable Crafts, endowed with proceeds from our unexpectedly successful first year of business. "Nervous about your speech?" Eric asked, knowing public speaking had never been my favorite activity. I shook my head. "Not nervous, just reflective. It's been quite a year." "That's an understatement," he chuckled. The business had flourished beyond our projections, with orders coming in from across the country as word spread about our unique approach to furniture making. Eric had hired 4 skilled artisans from the region and established an apprenticeship program that was already attracting talented young woodworkers eager to learn traditional techniques. My own life had settled into a new, satisfying rhythm. I had returned to teaching in Raleigh, but arranged my schedule to spend long weekends and school breaks in Asheville. The writing desk Eric had crafted for me now sat in the cabin's small second bedroom, which I'd converted into a study where I was slowly working on a book about Uncle Lawrence's approach to land stewardship. "Have you decided about the job offer?" Eric asked, breaking our companionable silence. Asheville Community College had recently approached me about teaching environmental literature part-time, a position that would allow me to relocate permanently to the mountains if I chose to accept it. "I'm leaning toward yes," I admitted. "I love my students in Raleigh, but this feels like where I'm supposed to be now." Eric nodded, understanding. "The land has a way of calling you back. Once it gets in your blood." Lightning flashed again, closer now, followed by a low rumble of thunder. The first fat raindrops began to fall, pattering on the leaves around us. "We should head back," Eric said, rising from the bench, "though I suspect you'd sit here through a hurricane if given the choice." I laughed, knowing he was right. Uncle Lawrence used to say storms were the mountain's way, of reminding us who's really in charge. We made our way down the path as the rain intensified, arriving at the cabin just as the downpour began in earnest. Marlene met us at the door with towels, clucking disapprovingly at our dampness but smiling nonetheless. The cabin's interior glowed with warm light against the gathering darkness outside. Over the past year, it had evolved into a perfect blend of Uncle Lawrence's austere practicality and Marlene's cozy domesticity, still simple and unpretentious, but undeniably a home rather than merely a shelter. After changing into dry clothes, I joined them at the kitchen table, where Marlene had laid out a simple dinner of homemade soup and fresh bread. The comfortable familiarity of this ritual, sharing meals in this space with these people who had become my chosen family, never failed to fill me with quiet gratitude. "I had a call from Blue Sky Development today," Eric mentioned as he buttered a slice of bread. "They've apparently been following our progress." I tensed slightly, memories of their involvement in our conflict still raw. "What did they want?" "To apologize, oddly enough," he replied, looking as surprised as I felt. "And to Inquire about consulting services. Seems they're interested in more sustainable approaches to their mountain properties. Their PR team probably calculated that green sells better than clear cut. And what did you tell them? Marlene asked, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. Eric smiled. I told them we'd be happy to consult, for a substantial fee that would go directly to expanding the conservation trust to protect more land in the area. I nearly choked on my soup. You didn't? I absolutely did, he confirmed, looking rather pleased with himself. If they're serious about changing their practices, they can put their money where their mouth is. If not, no harm done. Lawrence would have loved that, Marlene said, her eyes twinkling, using their own tactics against them for a good cause. After dinner, as the storm raged outside, we gathered in the living room. Eric built a fire to ward off the damp chill, and Marlene brought out a photo album I hadn't seen before. Pictures of Lawrence as a young man before Vietnam, his smile easy and unguarded in a way I'd never witnessed in life. I found these when I was cleaning out my storage unit in town, she explained gently, turning the pages. Thought you both might like to see them. There were photos of Lawrence and Marlene hiking mountain trails, fishing in crystal streams, dancing at what appeared to be a local festival, and, most surprisingly, several shots of Lawrence with our father, the two brothers looking remarkably alike in their youth, arms slung casually around each other's shoulders. They were close. Once, Marlene said softly, noting my surprise. Before the war changed Lawrence, before your grandfather's business demands changed your father. They had different responses to life's pressures, but they started from the same place. Good men who valued honesty and hard work. Eric studied a particular photo intensely. Lawrence and our father building what appeared to be a simple cabin. Is this the original structure of this very cabin? Marlene confirmed. They built it together the summer before Lawrence enlisted. Your father wanted it as a hunting lodge. Lawrence envisioned it as a retreat from the world. I had no idea, Eric murmured, touching the photo reverently. Dad never mentioned they built it together. Some memories become too painful to revisit, Marlene said, gently, especially when relationships change in ways we don't understand. As the evening wore on and the storm gradually subsided, our conversation meandered through memories, some shared, some newly discovered through Marlene's stories and Lawrence's letters, which I had eventually shared with Eric after careful consideration. When Eric finally rose to leave for his apartment in town, the night had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars through the cabin windows. See you both tomorrow for the big announcement, he said, hugging Marlene, and then, after a moment's hesitation, me as well. These gestures of physical affection were still new between us, part of the ongoing healing that continued to unfold in small, meaningful moments. After he'd gone, I stepped onto the porch, drawn by the crystalline beauty of the post-storm sky. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and pine, clean and renewing. From this elevation, I could just make out the soft lights of the showroom at the base of the property, a warm beacon in the darkness. Marlene joined me, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. Penny, for your thoughts? I smiled, turning to this remarkable woman who had become family in every way that mattered. I was just thinking about how different everything is from when I first came for the funeral. How impossible this all would have seemed then. She nodded, understanding as always. Life has a way of surprising us with its circles. Endings become beginnings. Conflicts yield to peace. Nothing is ever truly lost if we have the courage to find our way. Back to what matters. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, the same stars Uncle Lawrence had watched from this very spot for decades. I felt his presence not as a ghost, but as a continuation, his values living on through the land he'd protected, through the business that now bore his name, through the changed heart of his nephew, and through my own deepening connection to this place he'd loved. The legacy isn't just the land, is it? I said softly. No, dear, Marlene replied, her voice gentle with wisdom. The legacy is what we choose to become because of it. As I took one last look at the star-filled sky before heading inside, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not an ending, but a circle closing, only to open again into new possibilities. The anger and betrayal that had brought me to this mountain had transformed into something I never could have anticipated. Forgiveness, understanding, and a deeper sense of belonging than I'd ever known. Uncle Lawrence's final gift hadn't been the property itself, but the journey it had initiated, a journey that had brought me home in every sense of the word. And in that knowledge, I found peace.